Welcome to the Forge, my wanton wildlings. I'm your creepsmith, and I hope you like my work. Everyone knows that the scariest thing in our world, responsible for more horror than any monster, is the human mind. So what happens when some damn fool gives it form? By an unknown author, this is Tulpa.
Last year, I spent 6 months participating in what I was told was a psychological experiment. I found an ad in my local paper looking for imaginative people looking to make good money. And since it was the only ad that week that I was remotely qualified for, I gave them a call and we arranged an interview. They told me that all I'd have to do is stay in a room, alone, with sensors attached to my head to read my brain activity, and while I was there I would visualize myself having a double. They called it my Tulpa. It seemed easy enough, and I agreed to do it as soon as they told me how much I'd be paid. The next day, I began. They brought me to a simple room and gave me a bed, then attached the sensors to me and hooked them into a little black box on the table beside me. They talked me through the process of visualizing my double again and explained that if I got bored or restless, instead of moving around, I should visualize my double moving around, or try to interact with him, that sort of thing. The idea was to keep him with me the entire time I was in the room. I had some trouble with it for the first few days. It was more controlled than any sort of daydreaming that I had done before. I'd imagine my double for a few minutes and then grow distracted, but by the fourth day I could manage to keep him present for the entire 6 hours. They told me that I was doing very well. The second week they gave me a different room with wall-mounted speakers. They told me that they wanted to see if I could still keep the Tulpa with me in spite of distracting stimuli. The music was discordant, ugly, and unsettling, and it made the process a little more difficult, but I managed nonetheless. The next week they played even more unsettling music, punctuated with shrieks, feedback loops, and what sounded like an old-school modem dialing up. It also had guttural voices speaking some kind of foreign language. Yeah, I just laughed that off. I was a pro by then. After about a month, I started to get bored. To liven things up, I started interacting with my doppelganger. We'd have conversations or play rock, paper, scissors, or I'd imagine him juggling, breakdancing, whatever caught my fancy. I asked the researchers if my foolishness would adversely affect their study, but they encouraged me. So we played, we communicated, and that was fun for a while. Then it started to get a little strange. I was telling him about my first date one day, and he corrected me. I'd said that my date was wearing a yellow top, and he told me that it was a green one. I thought about it for a second, and I realized he was right. It creeped me out, and after my shift that day, I talked to the researchers about it. "You're using the thought form to access your subconscious," they explained. "You knew on some level that you were wrong, and you subconsciously corrected yourself." What had been creepy was suddenly cool. I was talking to my subconscious. It took some practice, but I found that I could question my Tulpa and access all sorts of memories. I could make it quote whole pages of books that I'd only read once years before, or cite things that I was taught and immediately forgot in high school. It was awesome. That was around the time I started calling up my double outside of the research center. Not often at first, but I was so used to imagining him by now that it was almost odd not to see him. So whenever I was bored, I'd visualize him. Eventually I started doing it almost all the time. It was amusing to take him along like an invisible friend. I imagined him when I was hanging out with friends or visiting my mom. I even brought him along on a date once. I didn't need to speak aloud to him, so I was able to carry out entire conversations with him, and no one was the wiser. Now, I know it sounds strange, but it was fun. Not only was he a walking repository of everything that I knew and everything that I'd forgotten, he also seemed more in touch with me than I did at times. He had an uncanny grasp of the minutiae of body language that I didn't even realize I was picking up on. For example, I thought the date that I had brought him along on was going badly, but he pointed out how she was laughing just a little too hard at my jokes and leaning towards me as I spoke, and a bunch of subtle clues that I didn't know I was consciously picking up on. I listened and, well, let's just say that that date went very well. By the time that I'd been at the research center for 4 months, he was with me constantly. The researchers approached me one day after my shift and asked me if I had stopped visualizing him. I denied it, and they seemed pleased. I silently asked my double if he knew what had prompted that, but he just shrugged it off, so did I. I withdrew a little from the world at that point. I was having some trouble relating to people. It seemed to me that they were so confused and unsure of themselves, while I had a manifestation of myself to confer with. It made socializing awkward. Nobody else seemed to be aware of the reasons behind their actions, why some things made them angry and others made them laugh. They didn't know what moved them, but I did, or at least I could ask myself and get an answer. A friend, confronted me one evening. He pounded at the door until I answered it and came in fuming and swearing up a storm. "You haven't answered when I called you in fucking weeks, you dick! What's your fucking problem?" Well, I was about to apologize to him, and I probably would have offered to hit the bars with him that night, but my Tulpa suddenly grew furious. "Hit him!" he said, and before I knew what I was doing, I had. I heard his nose break. He fell to the floor and then came up swinging, and we beat each other up and down my apartment. I was more furious than I'd ever been, and I was not merciful. I knocked him to the ground and gave him 2 savage kicks to the ribs, and that was when he fled, hunched over and sobbing. The police came by a few minutes later, but I told them that he had been the instigator, and since he wasn't around to refute me, they let me off with a warning. My Tulpa was grinning the entire time. We spent the night crowing about my victory and sneering over how badly I had beaten my friend. It wasn't until the next morning, when I was checking out my black eye and cut lip in a mirror, that I remembered what had set me off. My double was the one who'd grown furious, not me. I'd been feeling guilty and a little ashamed, but he goaded me into a vicious fight with a concerned friend. He was present, of course, and he knew what I was thinking. You don't need him anymore. You don't need anyone else, he told me. And I started to feel my skin crawl. I explained all of this to the researchers who employed me, but they just laughed it off. "You can't be scared of something that you're imagining," one told me. My double stood beside him, nodded his head. Then he smirked at me. I tried to take their words to heart, but over the next few days I found myself growing more and more anxious around my Tulpa. It seemed like he was changing. He looked taller, more menacing. His eyes were mischievous, and I saw malice in his constant smile. I decided that no job was worth losing my mind over. If he was out of control, I'd simply put him down. I was so used to him at that point that visualizing him was an automatic process, so I started trying my damnedest not to visualize him. It took a few days, but it started to work, somewhat. I could get rid of him for hours at a time, but every time that he'd come back, he seemed worse. His skin seemed ashen. His teeth were more pointed. He hissed and gibbered and threatened and swore. That discordant music that I'd been listening to for months, it seemed to accompany him everywhere. Even when I was at home, I'd relax and slip up, no longer concentrating on not seeing him. And there he'd be, with all that howling noise with him. At this point, I was still visiting the research center and spending my 6 hours a day there. I needed the money, and I thought that maybe they weren't aware that I was now actively not visualizing my Tulpa. I was wrong. After my shift one day, about 5.5 months in, two impressively large men grabbed me and restrained me, and somebody in a lab coat jabbed a hypodermic needle into my body. I woke up from my stupor, back in the room, strapped to the bed, music blaring, with my doppelganger standing over me and cackling. He hardly looked human anymore. His features were twisted. His eyes were sunken in their sockets and filmed over like a corpse. He was much taller than me, but hunched over. His hands were twisted and his fingernails were like talons. In short, he was fucking terrifying. I tried to will him away, but I just couldn't seem to concentrate. He giggled and tapped the IV on my arm. I thrashed in my restraints as best I could, but I could hardly move at all. They're pumping you full of the good shit, I think. How's the mind? All fuzzy. He leaned closer and closer with every word he spoke. I gagged. His breath smelled like spoiled meat. I tried to focus, but I simply couldn't banish him. The next few weeks were terrible. Every so often, someone in a doctor's coat would come and inject me with something or force-feed me a pill. They kept me dizzy and unfocused. And sometimes they left me hallucinating or delusional. My thought form was still present, of course, constantly mocking me. He interacted with, or perhaps caused, my delusions. I hallucinated that my mother was there, scolding me, and then he cut her throat and blood showered me. It was so real I could taste it. The doctors never spoke to me. I begged at times. I screamed, hurled invectives, demanded answers. They never spoke to me. They may have talked to my Tulpa, my personal monster. I'm not sure. I was so doped and confused that it might have just been more delusion, but I remember them talking with him. I grew convinced that he was the real one and I was the thought form. He, of course, encouraged that line of thought at times, mocked me at others. Another thing that I pray was a delusion. He could touch me. More than that, he could hurt me. He'd poke and prod at me as if he felt I wasn't paying enough attention to him. Once, he grabbed my testicles and squeezed until I told him I loved him. Another time, he slashed at my forearm with one of his talons. I still have a scar, and most days I can convince myself that I injured myself and just hallucinated that he was responsible. Most days. Then one day, while he was telling me a story about how he was going to gut everyone I loved, starting with my sister, he paused. This querulous look crossed his face, and he reached out and touched my head, like my mother used to when I was feverish. He stayed still for a long moment, and then he smiled. All thoughts are created, he told me. Then he walked out the door. 3 hours later, I was given an injection and passed out. I awoke unrestrained. Shaking, I made my way to the door and I found it unlocked. I walked out into the empty hallway and I ran. I stumbled more than once, but I made it down the stairs and out into the lot behind the building. There I collapsed, weeping like a child. I knew I had to keep moving, but I couldn't manage it. I got home eventually. I don't remember how. I locked the door and shoved a dresser against it, and then I took a long shower. I slept for a day and a half. Nobody came for me in the night. Nobody came the next day or the one after that. It was over. I had spent a week locked in that room, but it had felt like a century. I'd withdrawn so much from my life beforehand that nobody even knew I was missing. The police didn't find anything. The research center was empty when they searched it. The paper trail fell apart. The names I'd given them were aliases. Even the money I'd been paid was apparently untraceable. I recovered as much as one can. I don't leave the house much. I have panic attacks when I do. I cry a lot. I don't sleep much, and my nightmares are terrible. It's over, I tell myself. I survived. I use the concentration those bastards taught me to convince myself. And it works. Sometimes. Not today, though. Not today. 3 days ago, I got a phone call from my mother. There had been a tragedy. My sister, you see, she's the latest victim in a spree of killings, the police say. This perpetrator mugs his victims and then guts them. The funeral was this afternoon. It was as lovely a service as a funeral can be, I suppose. I was a little distracted, though. During the service, all I could hear was music coming from somewhere far away. Discordant, unsettling stuff that sounds like feedback, and shrieking, and a modem dialing up. I can still hear it. It's a little louder now. So if you're like me and you get teased or insulted for being nuts, remember, at least your personal demons haven't gutted anyone. I hope. Keep yourselves safe till next we meet, wildlings. Stay scary and make the most of your nights.